Leviticus. The first 4 chapters starting off. As we left the previous book, Exodus, the last thing was mentioned is the building, the completion, the finality of the tabernacle. And God's presence comes down and overwhelms it so much so that no one can even enter into the presence of God. And so from that kind of understanding, this book starts off. Verse 1, you have God speaking to Moses from within the congregation tent. It does not say that Moses is in the tent, but says that God speaks from the tent to Moses. This entire book is a book which will go through much detail regarding the priests, regarding how to interact with God, how the people can begin to enter into this new relationship in the sense of living out the covenant, experiencing God's holiness, even though mankind is very far from God. So there's to be much that will be established, not just with the priests, but also with just any of the people that are in the camp. The first 4 chapters today specifically deal with the burnt offerings, peace offerings, grain offerings, and sin offerings. And you have 2 different kind of ideas behind this. One is this idea of saying thank you and just celebrating God's blessing and covenant. You see this with the peace offering, you see it with the grain offering, and then beyond that, sin again is a huge theme throughout, especially regarding the holiness of God. And you have the burnt offering, and you have the sin offering that deals with the idea of atonement, or making oneself right with God, correcting a wrong. And this is required even just to maintain fellowship, to maintain any type of relationship with God. There has to be some type of sacrifice that is met. And the other end of the spectrum, the peace and the grain offerings, this is more of like the idea of a covenant meal, a fellowship, a type of communing and saying thank you to and with God. So again, these are laid out in much detail in these 4 chapters, and you'll see some of these themes carried on throughout the rest of this book. Bless y'all today. This is a very different type of reading, but it will be edifying even in and of itself. So thanks. A few points on Leviticus 5 through 7 today. You'll see here again regarding the different sacrificial offerings, guilt offering, sin offering, peace offering, burnt offering. There's several things that come up. One thing, especially with the sin offering, confession is a part of the process. It's not simply just doing some kind of act to annul what was done, but the confession of it is definitely a part of that. So you see that obviously going into the New Testament, but that's also the case here. Beyond that, there's a lot of things that you'll notice coming up regarding space, and much of the language is foreign to us because we're in such a different time, and especially with the New Covenant now. But things are additionally different because there's this understanding of holy ground, holy things, this idea of holiness almost even kind of having this contagious kind of quality to it. When you see that anything that touches an item that's holy becomes holy, and then in the inverse, you have this much process that has to be done in order to go into kind of a holy area. You'll see a lot of this as we go forward about the different ritual aspects of being clean and unclean, and that's more so just teaching God's people about God's presence, this idea of being set apart, and that there's a very special nature to God, and being prepared for that as you enter into His presence. So a lot of the little details here. Much diligence as we travel through the book of Leviticus. It's a unique book, but definitely important for the principles that it does teach and establish. So bless y'all. Hope y'all are having an awesome Friday. Leviticus 8 through 10 begins what has previously been a lot of detail to what would be set up. Now you have the inauguration of this process of sacrifices and the tabernacle system. Aaron and his sons are all ordained and set up to be priests. You have the end of chapter 8. After this long preparation and process, they're told to remain and wait 7 days. This begins chapter 9 on the 8th day. They officially inaugurate and kind of have this big ceremony and procession of the different sacrifices being performed. First, Aaron has to be purified of his own sins, and then he can, on behalf of the entire congregation, have another purification offering. And at the end of chapter 9, you see God again show up, this time in a way that the fire comes down and absolutely consumes the offering. The response to God's glory is key in that everyone falls down, cries out, and worships. Chapter 10, right in the same moment, you see a different response from Nadab and Abihu. They go and they get embers. They go through a process of putting it on the altar and having incense about it, all in a way that it was not ordained by God at all. Something that God had not commissioned, no instruction had been given, apparently acting of their own volition and going rogue in a sense. God's fire actually consumes them, and to compound it even worse, Moses points out the holiness of God that God is demonstrating, and that all these instructions are given for a reason. But beyond that, Aaron is told that he cannot grieve or rip their priestly cloaks, or the other two sons that are left, because they have to maintain their role of representation of the congregation to God. And yet the congregation is allowed to grieve and lament, but they have to keep that kind of dignity together. And obviously there's much that they would be going through and grieving, even though they were not able to publicly or officially grieve. You do see instruction given of that they have to be able to stay sober, and then even some frustration in that some of the offerings and sacrifices are not performed correctly just after that. And when Moses confronts them, these other two sons, about this, basically Aaron says, look, we've been through a lot, and there's kind of this understanding, and Moses kind of backs off. So you see a lot going on here. This is a very, again, a difficult chapter in the context of the humanity of it, but there's a specific holiness to God, and again, a lot of that's been Leviticus 11 through 13 today. Simple post in the fact of you just have these three kind of different topics through the process today, and you have much that revolves around keeping people prepared to be able to be in God's presence. This idea of purity, this idea of cleanliness. This is in a ritual kind of sense, being acceptable to God, not in the sense of an ethical or a moral problem, but in the sense of us being set apart. So you have clean and unclean animals that the people were to eat. That specifications are laid out in detail in chapter 11. And then in chapter 12, childbirth is important, especially because of the process of bringing forth life. Obviously, there's much blood loss in childbirth. And then what does it take to become pure again, to go back into sacred space and God's presence after that? And finally, skin diseases were a part of life. The priest was involved in making sure that people were healed up in a proper sense. So whatever amount of time needed to pass in a ritual sense, the priest would monitor these situations, helping the people be in the right context for the Lord. Good evening. Leviticus 14 and 15 today. You have two different chapters, again, on the ritual kind of nature of purity and impurity. Chapter 14 involves some follow-up from the ideas in 13, where you have skin disease, and even you have impurities in the side of a house. Much given detail on sacrifices and the whole process of how to go through all the different scenarios to make sure that these, either the persons or the buildings, the structures are pure and do not violate anyone, for this idea of participating in the fellowship with God. Chapter 15 involves bodily discharge, and you'll see mainly things that involve either sex or childbirth, things that are creative in nature, bringing forth life into the world. This understanding of what that is, but yet at the same time, when you see loss of blood or things that are not within that creative process, there's this idea of what has to be done, or how much time it has to pass before. Leviticus 16, 17, and 18 today. Chapter 16, it picks up right after the event where Aaron's sons passed. And it says God will speak to Moses right after this event and establish some important things regarding once a year where the nation would be cleansed in the sense of the sin and this idea of atonement, known as the Day of Atonement, called Yom Kippur in the Jewish tradition and faith. On this day, there'd be two goats. One would be sacrificed, and the other would have this kind of ritual provision of the sins of the people being conveyed onto the goat, and the goat being driven out into the wilderness literally the wilderness of Azazel, this idea of the sin of the people being cast off and carried out to where the sin would be dealt with, and the nation in turn released or recovered. Chapter 17 talks a lot about orienting the people to begin to understand that they would have to do all their sacrifices there at the tabernacle. They would no longer just kill animals wherever. This is a kind of realigning of their understanding. And much of the chapters going forward now will present this idea of holiness, how people are to live. There's much aspects that move past just being unclean to how do I live a holy life in ways that are morally ethical, presenting a new kind of life before God that's pure. So much in 17 regards sacrifice, but 18 is how one lives, many sexual kind of rules and specifics, even gets into child sacrifice, other gods, things that were culturally acceptable in that time that the children of Israel had to be specifically set apart and be a people that's even different. Because 19, you have many more moral and ceremonial laws within the holiness code of how to live. Some specifics include be holy because I'm holy, and then again what will become very reinforced throughout even the New Testament, love your neighbor as yourself, that you're to love one another. And then even the poor, you see a lot about caring for the neighbors and sojourners because of the time the Israelites spent in Egypt. They're very familiar with the plight of anyone who's a stranger in the land. Exodus 20, or Leviticus 20 rather, talks a lot about the different penalties for the law. Again, there's a cultural background of the ancient Phoenician worship of Moloch, not just child sacrifice, but you have homosexuality, bestiality, incest, all type of medium worship. And so again, there's many harsh distinctions to separate the children of Israel. And then in Leviticus 20, Leviticus 21, many more specifics regarding the priests, ordination, how they're to live, things that do and do not qualify future generations of priests. Leviticus 22 and 23 today. In chapter 22, you have a lot more specifications and regulations regarding the priests and the priesthood, specifically how to sacrifice, ways that they need to protect God's name, his reputation. Beyond that, you see many more things about the perfect sacrifice, the idea of not just what type of animal, but what condition the animal can be brought to God in. And then throughout 22, you see those type of things. In chapter 23 rather shifts to this idea of all the different feasts that would be in the land and memorials, special holidays and things that they would honor. 4 of those in chapter 23. You have Passover, you have the Feast of Trumpets, and then Tabernacles, and then, of course, the Day of Atonement, which we talked about, chapter 16. So these are the official kind of descriptive details of these events. Apologies. To make the complete list exhaustive from yesterday, chapter 23, verses 6 through 22, you have the 3 other out of the full 7 feast. Unleavened bread picks up kind of right after the Passover, Feast of First Fruits, Feast of Weeks. So many of these things are regarding the harvest and recognition of the different principles that were in the land at the time. Chapter 24, you have a lot of different customary laws in the sense of honoring God, not blaspheming his name. There's actually a man who is stoned towards the end of the chapter. These laws apply for anyone who's an outsider or anyone who is actually brought up within the camp itself. Some specifics on keeping the care of the congregation tent. The lamps were never allowed to burn out during the evening, and then also the showbread table had to be replenished every week and always had to have the bread there before the Lord. Now Aaron and his sons would, or whoever was serving as the priests, would eat this in a holy place once a week, but otherwise it was always there before the Lord as the bread of his presence. Chapter 25 is a very long chapter, but it's consistently talking about the Sabbath, much specifics on the Sabbath, how that process would affect the land, how it would also be honored in a different way in the 7th Sabbath with an extra additional year. So they would have 2 years every 50 years, and that 50th year would be considered the year of Jubilee. And this is a time where, not in the cities, but in the land, all land would be returned. There are some laws in here regarding slavery and different possession. Final two chapters of Leviticus today. Chapter 26 really puts a bow on the entire book. You have a reminder of the covenant, many promises of blessing if the children of Israel would obey the covenant, and of course cursing if they did not obey the covenant, and yet redemption if they would return back and repent to God. Chapter 27 has this kind of continuing idea of establishing principles, kind of a justice and equality kind of principle in the sense of doing vows regarding persons, animals, house, items, tithe, very specific kind of system being set up just to make sure there's a standard being set on any kind of a personal vow. Not telling people to necessarily make them, but in the event they do, to not kind of have this outlandish injustice. So that's Leviticus. It's a great book in the sense of establishing a baseline precedent for who God is, and of course the separation, the